You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today we're going to go into the history of fire, and that has been a very common question and feedback that you all have been giving me on what you'd like to hear about. So I was able to invite and successfully get Dr. Stephen Pyne on the show. Thank you, Dr. Pyne, for taking the time. I know that you're a busy person. I thought there would be no one better, though, to talk about the history of fire, given you've written several books on the subject.
Well, thank you for the invitation. But if you really want me to talk, you'll have to quit calling me Dr. Pyne. Let's just make it Steve.
Okay, Steve, good enough. Well, Steve, so I've been doing the show for a while now, and I've had a variety of people on the show, and we've talked about quite a few things. But the question that keeps coming up, as I said a few minutes ago, the question that keeps coming up is, what about the historical perspective of fire, particularly thinking about, I guess, the evolution of systems with fire and what the role of humans has been in that. I know that you've researched and wrote about that quite a bit. So I was curious, where would you start if you were going to tell someone the history of fire?
Well, we could start 420 million years ago when we first have fossil charcoal. Basically, as soon as life began colonizing continents, it created stuff to burn, and life had already oxygenated the atmosphere, and lightning was abundant, so you have all the ingredients, and we start having fire. And so all of terrestrial life has really co-evolved with fire somewhere. Not every plant, animal, etc., but it's been on there continuously. And a big breakthrough comes, a phase change comes when a genus, the hominins, acquired the ability to start fire. And their research even suggests that it's part of our genome, that it was cooking, the ability to extract more nutrients and caloric value than eating raw food was what allowed us to have big heads and small guts. So all of the hominins, there's only one of us left, had fire in their makeup. And so now that leaves us, the sapiens, as sort of a species monopolist on fire. The fire is what we do. You know, other animals knock over trees and dig holes in the ground. We do fire. So it's really our ecological signature. So we made a pact with fire long ago, and we would expand the domain of fire, and fire would help us expand our own domain. So we've taken fire to all kinds of places where fire could never have existed on its own. And we even go off planet with fire. So the problem is that the next phase change, the problematic phase change, it comes when we decide that burning living landscapes like you have in your background shot isn't enough. And so we start burning what I think of as lithic landscapes, that is fossilized landscapes. So we take stuff out of the geologic past, we're burning it in the present with all kinds of interactions that we really don't understand. And then we're releasing the effluent into the geologic future, essentially. So I think people have been perturbing the climate since the last ice age. And so for me, that's not a new thing, but it really went on afterburners when we could tap into essentially a whole nother planet if it becomes accessible. And that simply overwhelms the capabilities of the poor Earth to absorb all of this stuff. And we're seeing the consequences. So I think if you want to understand what the future is like, what we've done, think about an ice age. The Pleistocene was characterized by repeated ice ages, broken by short interglacial warm spells. Imagine an ice age, but refracting that through a prism called fire, And what does it look like? Well, it looks like the world we're seeing created, with climate changing, fire driving off ice, mass extinctions, changes in sea levels, all kinds of stuff. So unfortunately, our mutual assistance pact is looking more and more like a Faustian bargain. So we really need to rein that in. But I think one of the paradoxes your audience, I think, will appreciate, but most people in the public won't, is that as we ratchet down our burning of fossil fuels, we have to ratchet up our burning in living landscapes. In effect, we thought we could treat the countryside and wildlands the same way we did our house. We could take fire out. No, we don't need working flames, et cetera. Well, it turns out we do, because there are all kinds of ecological considerations apart from fuel generating, giving it, enhancing these fires, the bad fires that we don't want. But we need to do that. So we've got a lot of fire in our future.
Yeah.
Well, that's in a little longer spell than you probably wanted, but that's sort of the thumbnail history of fire on the planet.
No, I think that's a really interesting perspective, and I haven't really thought about it, I guess, from the, or I don't know if the audience has, certainly not all of them have thought about it as, we're burning living landscapes versus the fossilized landscape that you were talking about, or the fuel. So it's an interesting perspective.
They compete originally, and you can see there are some satellite images, Earth at night, and you see all these wonderful lights, but you get the right setting, and you can see Europe aglow with electric lights, and then you come to sub-Sahara Africa, and it's all burning in living landscapes. They're burning of various kinds. And my study of this shows that one is actively replacing the other. So when we start going to this, imagine, could we pretend to fight fire as we do in places like California if we took away all of our airplanes and helicopters, our tractor plows and engines and bulldozers and chainsaws and pumps? No, we couldn't. In effect, we have a counterfire that allows us to deal with it. But that has blowback written all over, and we've seen that. And the other part is the climate change element, that by liberating this into the atmosphere, which is a global commons, places which have not made this transition are still subject to the effects through climate. But we've got in places like much of the United States, we've got places where you're getting it on both sides. We took it out. We've got all kinds of consequences for that. And then we add on climate change in addition to that, and we shouldn't be surprised that it's way out of our control. And it should give us pause that megafires are actually a pathology of the developed world. Why is it that people who have all the science, all the machinery, all this power, fire-driven power, are unable to control fire in the landscapes, but other people maintaining more traditional styles are?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So how long, given talking about the traditional management, how long have humans been using fire to shape the landscape in North America?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know, because we're still, the repeated ice ages tended to scour everything out, including pathways into the Americas. So we're still debating when humans, at least Homo sapiens, arrive. The real stunner will be if we find Homo erectus. We've never looked because we assumed it couldn't have made it, but there's no reason why it couldn't have. That will be the stunner. So when people were here, they would be burning. And what you've got at the end of the last ice age is a fire-wielding creature who carries fire everywhere he goes, and an increasingly fire-receptive landscape. So as the ice melts, it becomes recolonized with vegetation, plants and animals, all this stuff. Well, fire through people becomes a part of that mix, as well as fires from lightning. So some studies came out, I think, last summer, which identified in central Africa human manipulation of landscapes through fire dating back 85,000 years. So that's well into the previous glacial age. But that was not a glaciated area. It was affected peripherally, the climate and all this other sorts of stuff. So people had it, but they had to have the circumstances that could receive fire and propagate it. So if your primary control over fire is ignition, you can control the timing and place of ignition. That's extraordinarily powerful. But you have to have a landscape that's already primed to burn.
Right.
Then you preemptively take control over that landscape and redirect it. But starting fires doesn't mean anything unless that environment can propagate it. So I think in a global sense, what we see is with the removal of the ice age, we see a land that is more and more capable of receiving fire, and we have a species that is sort of committed to a fire-sculpted landscape. And even with just what I think of as an Aboriginal fire economy, namely the control over the torch, you can do an awful lot. And you can, even in terms of climate. And one reason is that we think, again, our European heritage works against us so often, that change has to come with agriculture. It has to come by clearing the forest, removing all this stuff. But it's very powerful. It could be of equal or greater power to prevent the forest from growing up in the first place. And that's what a lot of Aboriginal fire economies did. By regularly burning, they kept it thinned out, they kept it in savannas, they kept it in tall grass prairie. That's a lot of places. And when fires were removed, historically, they all grew up to trees.
Right.
So so the two of these begin interacting. And then if you want to carry fire further, places that are not intrinsically prone to burn, which means they don't go through regular wetting and drying cycles, and they don't experience dry lightning and so forth. Those places, you have to modify the fuels. And from my perspective, that's what agriculture does. So you cut, dry, burn, you drain wetlands, and then burn. We burn anything could be out there burned. I mean, all agriculture outside of floodplains is basically based on fire at some point in the cycle. And I think that's also why agriculture, traditional agriculture, had a fallowing period. I mean, which intellectuals hated. I mean, here you are, you're always on the cusp of starvation, and you take this out of production every third year or so, or whatever. I mean, this is a huge amount of area. And then you have to feed your livestock and the rest of it. So you're really on the margin. So we got to, they hated fallow, but I think they got it backwards. And then not only did they leave fallow, then they burned it to get rid of it. And I think that the agronomists of those times had it backwards. It wasn't that you burned it to get rid of it. You had to grow it so that you could get fire, because at some point you need that jolt back in the system. Fire doesn't just do one thing like a tool. I see it as a kind of broad spectrum catalyst. It does all kinds of stuff out there. You need that sort of shock. And so that's it. So that allows you to expand into a lot of areas where you couldn't. It changes the whole patches and pulsing of fire. And we carry fire into a lot of places or remake it in places. And then one of the things that going to lithic landscapes, I hope I'm not annoying you with that term, but I find it convenient, is that the whole Green Revolution was sort of premised on access to that kind of stuff. I mean, machinery, get petrochemicals, fertilizers, pesticides. All of these other things come from distilling that. In effect, that takes the place of fallowing. And so one of the reasons the Green Revolution can increase productivity is because you're just growing fence post to fence post. You've eliminated the fallow. You don't have to feed your draft animals, so that can also go to crops, so you can expand it hugely. But then fallowing was also part of the ecological diversity and the biodiversity in the system. Those patches, those are ideal. That's where you want it. So when you eliminate that, then you've destroyed a lot of the ecological goods and services that were inherent in that. We've turned it into a kind of factory. And I think that for me, is one of the part of the explanation for why we began creating reserves and nature protected sites and so forth, because that's our alternative to what had been following. And then we thought, well, we could take fire out of that, and that would be a good thing. Well, it turns out some places, yeah, but most places, no. You've got to get the right kind of fire back in. So it's been a long learning curve. We got rich. I mean, in some ways, we treated combustion as though we're part of a factory farm, and we get one thing out of it. We just want raw power converted into electricity, steam, whatever. And we forget about all the other things it does, and all the other side effects, many of which we really valued, went away. And we thought that our firepower was enough to overcome any obstacle. And I think we found that was a very foolish conception, and time to be a little more humble about what we know and what we can do and ought to do.
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting perspective. A couple of things that come into mind. One, why do you think we have been so tightly coupled with fire? Like, what is driving that? Why have we taken fire everywhere we went?
Well, I think part of it is the cooking story, and as I said, we got when we learned to cook food, we got big heads and small guts. And then we learned to cook landscapes, and we went to the top of the food chain. And now we've begun cooking the planet, and we've become a geologic force. I just think we're never without fire.
Yeah.
We can't. I mean, even fire myths, origin myths, this is what we have. This is sort of our ultimate power. I mean, if you think of the Greek Roman Olympic gods, there were 12 of them. 2 of them were fire.
Yeah.
The goddess of the hearth, Vesta, and then the god of the forge, Vulcan. I mean, wow, 2 out of 12. That's a pretty high hit for.
Is there anything else that's represented more than once?
No, not that I know of.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it was so familiar. We can't imagine the world without it. And I've often thought if I wanted to write a thriller novel, this would be the way to do it, is to let some other creature get fire, and then watch our world unravel. Particularly if it's a real firebug, and you just watch. We just take it for granted now so much, and we have a hard time recapturing that sense of fire, particularly in the developed world, because it's passed through this sort of phase change, and we've substituted electricity or other stuff that we get by burning fossil fuels, and we don't see the fire. We don't see the fire in our cars. We don't see the fire in the power plant. We don't see the fire that's all around us, illuminating everything. So we don't, out of sight, out of mind. We don't realize that we're still dependent on fire. There's a need now to pivot out of that attachment to burning fire just for power, and recapture the other kinds of things that fire does. And in some ways that's hard because people don't experience it anymore. I mean, it's not that long ago that people routinely burned. I mean, I can remember growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, like 1950s, people burned their lawns. I mean, it's Bermuda grass. When the rain's going to come, you just get out there and you just burn it off, and the whole neighborhood burns it off. So what? It's 5 minutes of smoke, and then everybody's annoyed and whine, and then they go on. Well, now you're not allowed to do that anymore. We don't want any kind of open flame around us. It's too dangerous. So you have to rent a dethatching machine to sort of kill it up. So I'm running fossil fuels on this dethatching machine, and then I rake up all of the dry grass and stuff, stuff it into plastic bags, and then leave it out on the sidewalk so it can be taken out to a landfill in another fossil fuel powered truck. And then it's buried and decomposes to methane. Well, this is acceptable, but it's not acceptable just to burn it off.
Yeah.
And I think we just lost that. And it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah. Well, even my great grandparents, my parents talking about being with them in Alabama, that was exactly what they did. They just, basically set everything on fire all the time on all the family's land, that just set everything on fire all the time. It was pretty interesting. Burn the yard. We don't mow it. We burn it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a kind of spring cleaning.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of how it's just your biotic housekeeping. This is part of what you do, but that's gone out of people's normal experiences now. So fire can be very scary. The only thing they see are really images of bad fires, horrific fires, fires as devastation. And there are a lot of bad fires out there, but they have no reference otherwise to that. And to say, well, we really need to put a lot more, look how many, we burned 10 million acres last year with wildfires. I said, well, we probably should have 3 or 4 times that, maybe more, but in the form of good fire. So it's not, I look at that figure and I say, it's not too much, it's too little. And it's all the wrong kind.
Right.
We got too much bad fire, too little good fire, and too much combustion. That's my formula.
Yeah. Well, so referring to my last question, or the previous question, so we've taken fire with us and we've sculpted the landscape, as you said, and we don't even know how long in most places, but pretty much anywhere we've been, we've used fire where it's combustible at least, or even created conditions where it is. I wonder about that because I'm thinking about my specialty area with wildlife that are fire adapted or evolved with fire in some way. I would assume, and I'll let you just answer how you see fit, that a lot of the species that we think of formerly being very abundant on the landscape, many of which are not now, that are fire dependent, we were essentially driving that abundance on the landscape. But would you say that that's an accurate way to think about it?
We were certainly directing where the animals would go and what the seasonality would be, and expanding where possible the habitats that they favored. So those species that we wanted, we used fire to help promote. There's a story, it's one of my favorite fire stories in wildlife. It's actually British Indian, late 19th century. And just bear with me for a second. The guy was writing a letter to the journal, the Indian Forester, main forestry journal of its day. And he said, well, there's a curious thing here. When we first came, this area had a lot of fire, and it had no problem with tigers. And since we've installed fire protection, which they called fire conservancy, we now have a lot fewer fires, and we've got a real problem with tigers who are making themselves disagreeable. And you go back through that, you realize, well, people had burned. They had burned in a particular pattern, and the Indian caste system comes into play here, different peoples and different times using it. And that determined the habitat for the cheetal, the deer, which was a prime prey of the tigers. So in effect, everybody knows their place because it gets burned, and the burning is sort of orchestrating all this stuff. Well, when you stop burning, the deer don't know where to go because they've lost the beat in a sense, and so the tigers don't know where to go. So they show up outside the villages, which is the last thing. And it's a wonderful example of how all these pieces can come together again. Not that people just made it out of whole cloth. They were working with the systems, the ecological processes and arrangements that exist in living landscapes, and using fire to help tweak it, to move it around and assist. And most fire, we've got a lot of fire paintings of animal drives, most of them from the prairies, the 19th century. I mean, they're really wonderful stuff. But mostly people weren't driving animals, they were attracting animals to the fresh browse. And there's lots. And then there are some places where you've got both. I think of some reports, say from Virginia, Tidewater area, and others where, in effect, there were regular places that would be burned off. And you could do that to drive the animals into the water. They would be into the lake side or someplace where they could be easily harvested. But then that also rejuvenated the browse, so they would come back. So you just keep coming back in a cycle, and you can move around the landscape doing fire in different ways for different purposes at different times. And so there is a kind of, people are not so much the great boss as a kind of ringmaster. And I often think some of the great, I had a chance to visit some tallgrass prairie sites in the Flint Hills. And they were describing, well, they've got sort of free range bison now. And, 90% of the bison are on the most recently burned patch that's just coming out. Right. Well, we sort of know that. And a little bit on year-old stuff, and nobody's around anything after that because they can't eat it. It just might as well be cardboard. And I was thinking, well, people are here using fire, and you can begin moving these animals around. And they do that in some of the African game parks as well. But I was thinking, okay, suppose the bison now had the ability to start fire, and it could determine its own food sources. And suddenly the bison would be ruling the system. Not just for their own, but everything else, all the knock-on effects that would go on with it. But that's sort of where we are.
Right.
I mean, it's always struck me as astonishing that biologists didn't take an interest in fire, and they still don't in most basic biology texts. You have to get into more specialized fields. It got quarantined off with forestry and a little bit with rain management, but nobody really studied it. But suppose you had this Pleistocene megafauna, or not quite megafauna, that could start fires and went to every continent on the planet. Wouldn't that be a big subject for biology?
It should be.
I mean, wouldn't you think we'd have a dozen journals on this? And then nothing. Yeah. It just never got built into the subject.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I think I've read somewhere where you were talking about that at one point. But yeah, that it is interesting that it essentially has been left out of the biology textbook. Yeah. And someone who studies this on a daily basis, it is kind of striking that that's the case, especially when there's clearly had such a critical role in so many systems on the planet.
And apart from wildlife people were very important in recovering or sort of that fire connection for habitat, and but also a lot of people who raised wildlife raised livestock because they were also moving the animals around and could do that with fire. There's a lot of it, summer, winter pastures. You go back and forth, you burn. I mean, it's all part of it's not just one thing. It's all part of this complicated sort of medley of stuff that goes on. And fire is there. It's not the only thing, but it's a catalyst. It sort of gives it the jolt that keeps going. But certainly in your part of the world, wildlife, beginning with the bobwhite quail stud, Herbert Stoddard and others, the tall timbers research, and others building on that, was people interested in wildlife who were really outraged by what they saw as this fire exclusion project, and led the charge to reconsider. And it's interesting because wildlife is often used in the reverse way. I mean, I think of Bambi, and many people who are not connected in a more intimate way with wildlife or animals, free ranging, think of fire and it will harm things. It will harm nesting birds, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it can if you misuse it. But if people misused it in that way, they would have been out of the food chain a long time ago. They learned quickly when to do it and make it work, or you're going to be gone as well as everything else.
Right. That's a good point.
So, I mean, with all this burning, how did we get these landscapes that we love and treasure? We thought, well, so there was a certain amount of arrogance, I think, that we have modern science now, and all of these traditional things are really superstition and nonsense, and we will convert them to more efficient forms and apply ourselves in this way. And that turned out to be a really bad idea. But wildlife was very important. Even in the National Park Service, the Leopold Report, 1963, that reorient the Park Service to a more natural landscape. It was all done by basically wildlife biologists, and they saw the habitat just disappearing beneath this overgrown thicket of woody stuff, and that animals can't eat it, and pine needles that obscure anything on the ground, so there's nothing for them to eat. They leave. There are lots of examples. I think of Kruger National Park in South Africa, huge, and they tried eliminating fire at one point because they thought intrinsically it was harmful, and of course all the animals left the park because they were starving. So they had to put it back, and they think, well, we don't understand. We know the fire's bad, but somehow we've got to keep doing this or we lose the whole point of the park.
Right.
It's been a long, I mean, European intellectual history was not well adapted to fire. And I say this is a paradox because you've got many Europes. Mediterranean Europe is so fire prone.
Yeah.
And that's where 2 of the 12 Olympian gods. That's why there's fire there. But as you get into Central Europe and Northern Europe, you don't. And a lot of Central Europe is not a naturally fire-prone area.
Right.
It has no wet-dry cycle. The fire that's put in there is done by people. And so fire could be seen as simply a problem of social order or disorder. And that, unfortunately, is where forestry was created. It was an agronomic enterprise, and they saw fire simply as a problem of misbehavior. Our first professional forester, Bernard Furneaux, came from Prussia, married an American woman, came over, and he looked at the American fire scene and dismissed it all as one of bad habits and loose morals. He said there's no excuse for this kind of thing, not appreciating that there was a value to it. Well, he came out of a part of the world and a particular discipline looking at a very narrow part of that world, for which they saw themselves as competing against shepherds and farmers for that wood. And to take that and apply it around the rest of the world, taking yourself as normative rather than an anomaly on the global scale, pretty small part of the world actually, was a colossal disaster. And that's how we got, but that's part of the fire scene for the U.S. That and the reckless way in which fires were set during the settlement period. So particularly with railroads providing connections to markets, they would simply punch in a line, clear everything out. It would burn, some to convert for farming, some just to get rid of it, some just by accident. And the trains were notorious for throwing sparks everywhere. And then so you create this background of mega fires all over, and people, well, that's really a bad thing. We don't want that.
Yeah.
But they weren't willing. And if your prism for looking at that is forestry, this particular odd discipline of forestry as it developed out of Central Europe, then you're going to argue to eliminate all fire as best you can. Had it come out of another part of the world, or even out of Mediterranean Europe, we might have had a very different history, but it didn't. So they saw it as a problem of social control. And sought to extinguish it. There's a lot of interest now and a lot of discussion about the colonial experience, extinguishing Native American lore and practices, including fire. And that's true. But European intellectuals treated European peasants with the same disdain they did natives elsewhere for their use of fire, and wanted it to be removed. The real contrast is between we might call tradition and modernity. And modernity being part of this conversion to a fossil fuel society where you eliminate fire. And actually, I have to say, I'm happy my house is not filled with flame all over the place and smoke. I mean, that's the hazards are pretty high, and I'm pleased with that. But we can't take that and project it out over the countryside. It was just dumb, and they should have known better, but they weren't. And they wanted a very simple message. They saw themselves as in dire environmental circumstances. We're headed for a timber famine that's going to starve the country of industrial growth. We're headed for all these crises, and giant fires are being mobilized as backdrops to explain what's going on. And they weren't prepared for a nuanced message. Yeah, these fires are really bad. We need to stop them. But they're symptoms of a larger set of things, how we're living on the land and converting it. And we need to distinguish those from good fires. There are lots of things people are doing which make a lot of sense, and we should continue that. That seemed too complicated.
Right.
So I don't know why. I mean, people seem to be able to distinguish between a river that's flooding and a farm that's being irrigated without too much difficulty. I don't know why they couldn't distinguish between, a mega fire savaging the landscape and people just burning off their lawns and their back 40 and, their pastures and all the rest of it. But that's what happened. And so
that's really interesting to think of it that way.
And you see it today. A fire is being mobilized for on behalf of climate change arguments. So we need to get control of fossil fuels, and we need to wrestle the climate back into something that's better suited for us. And I'm fully on board with those efforts, and I even see how it fits in my understanding of fires as part of a continuous saga. But I see them making the same mistake, that fire is being demonized for this other cause, and we're not willing to say, well, we need both. We need to shut down this kind of fire and control these bad fires, but we also need to do a lot more in the good fire realm. Yeah. And they're not willing to do that. And I think it's for the same reasons, for the same motives that people a century ago were interested in promoting conservation. And so part of my job, I think, is to try to remind them, we don't want to make the same mistake. Yeah, fire is a very graphic thing, but if you demonize fire, then you're going to have problems later on.
Right. We need to stop the bad fires and increase, potentially to a substantial degree, the good fire.
I would like a lot of good fire to be just normal again. I mean, fire seems exceptional. Well, you can go to places. I've been to places, Brazil, Ghana, India, places where fire is just out there. And some of it's being misused as part of this land conversion stuff. Okay, fine. But the fire is it's just how you live. Yeah, this is how you clean up the garbage. This is how you clean up the fields. This is how you do all this stuff, and it's normal. It's not some kind of alien visitation that comes down and we have to fight off. It's just a part of living in this landscape. So, well, we can't do that everywhere. We're not going back to that degree, but there's a lot more we can do, and we need to make sure that isn't lost as we begin this next transition. Yeah,
I've definitely some of the argument that you were making with game being associated with fire, and we wouldn't have been using fire if we were damaging our resources that we'd be extracting it. That's actually a fairly compelling argument for the strategy I have taken to try to get people using fire, because a lot of landowners in the part of the world that I'm in are really interested in game species, and those game species are all facilitated by fire. That seems like a good avenue to encourage the use of fire. And it's interesting to hear your perspective on it, because I haven't thought about it from the historical perspective. But I present data and work with landowners all the time, showing the positive effects that burning have on the game of interest. Particularly, obviously, quail. You don't even have the quail if you don't have fire. And it's also interesting thinking about you're talking about some of the historical things about North America, and I just recently have been reading through some historical writings, trying to find early depictions of turkeys, wild turkey, and it led me down some really interesting things. Of course, Bartram had mentioned some things. I found some things from Daniel Boone. So, a bunch of people, some of our early figures.
Yeah.
And they described a landscape. I think Boone called it barrens across Kentucky. But they were describing this really open, savanna-like landscape. And they, at the same time, talked about having so many turkeys that they couldn't sleep in the mornings. And they were in nearly every tree for hundreds of miles in every direction. And Boone said that he traveled across Kentucky with them never out of sight.
Yeah.
It's just completely different thing. The landscape structure and the abundance of game that were of interest to people. It's just a very different perspective on things. So it's interesting to hear your take on it.
Well, I will mention one item that's become of interest recently, which is to say there are old Australian Aboriginal stories of birds setting fires. Yeah. And that's documented. There are raptors in northern Australia that can pick up a burning branch or stuff and drop it. And they're obviously doing this intentionally. They aren't, as far as I can tell, able to do more than that. But it's clear that most of our fire hunting and a lot of other stuff is all imitating nature. I mean, I've seen that outside Darwin, northern territories, and this whole fire drive. I mean, the fire's moving along, and so it's all the animals are scurrying about, getting out of the way, and insects are being lofted up, and so insectivorous birds are coming in and picking those off, and then you've got these raptors at the top, picking off whatever else they can, whatever shows up. And it wouldn't be very hard to figure out. If we could start this, we could do this at our own timing and place. And so, it's not that we invented something that's completely off, unimaginable. It's already embedded there. We're just domesticating it. We're redirecting it for our use. So,
not only they would see other species taking advantage of the fleeing prey, which we could mobilize or domesticate. We also then, weeks later, see mega herbivores or large herbivores out where they're visible in those recently burned areas. So it doesn't take very long to figure that out either. So very interesting. Well, I think this has been great conversation, and I always like to give a few minutes to the guests to, if there's anything that we've missed that you think people should know, or some take-home messages or something along those lines, please share.
Well, it's easy to beat up on our forebearers for not getting it and being sort of thick-headed about stuff. But we spent, in many ways, we can date the modern firefighting era, fire exclusion era, back to the 1910 fires that afflicted the Forest Service. If we do that, we spent the next 50 years trying to take fire out of all landscapes. And then we spent the last 50 years trying to put good fire back in. So it is not that the history has just been one thing. We recognized, 50 plus years ago, that this was a mistake and we needed to get fire back in. The Park Service reforms its policy in 1968, the Forest Service 10 years. These are not new things. We don't need new policies. We've just been unable to implement it at scale. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think it's easy, in some ways fun. What were these people thinking of? What dimwits? Well, a century from now, people are going to probably be looking back at us and say, these guys were so busy making fun of these others that they didn't realize that they were doing some really dumb stuff. They weren't paying attention. They now had it. They figured it out. But to recognize that we have been trying. People did learn. They learned very quickly in Florida. California is much tougher. for a lot of reasons. And we've also learned that it's not good to take experiences or practices that work in one place and just parachute them into another place.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to work. That there is a more intimate connection with the land. It's not just fire and fuel. It's fire and living systems and all the things that go into it, and all the people and their assumptions about how they choose to live, how they understand their place in the world, et cetera. All these things sort of come together, and that's what begins making the fire on the landscape. So, we've got a lot to do. We've got a lot of burning to do, but just burning just to burn and rack up quantifiable acres is not a solution.
Mm-hmm.
It really takes persistence and patience. So I would remind us that there's a place for us to be bold, but also a place to be properly humble.
Yeah, great point. Well, if people want to ask you questions or find you or your work, is there a good place that they can find you?
Well, I've got a web page, an author web page. It's Stephen Pyne, one word, StephenPyne.com. And that will give kind of an introduction. And I think there's an email possible through that as well.
Okay.
So I'd be happy to hear from people.
Yeah. Well, we will provide the link and the show notes for the episode. So anybody that's interested in reaching out to, I'm going to do it again, Dr. Pyne, you can find many of the works that he's talking about and contact information at that website.
Okay.
But, thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It's been fun. It's really awesome to hear about the historical perspective from you. So I really appreciate that.
Well, we all have different gifts and we have to contribute in our own way. And this is what I can do to it. So listen, thanks for the invitation and take care. Have a good day.
Our university is part of the Natural Resource University Podcast Network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.